In the evening, as usual, the town club was crowded. Music played loudly from the speakers, and in the center of the hall, in a cloud of acrid cigarette smoke, several girls were moving rhythmically. "Lillian, you're the prettiest one here tonight," grinned one of them, Margaret. "Only, I don't know what you're trying so hard for." "I'm just in a good mood," laughed Lillian. "Do you really think I'm interested in any of our country boys?" "Well, what about George?" asked Margaret. "He would do anything for you." Lillian looked at her friend with a smile and snorted contemptuously, saying that she deserved more than George, and she would surely find her prince in a fancy car who would take her to his mansion. Margaret looked at her friend doubtfully, and shrugged. "Okay, let's go home. We have to work tomorrow," said Margaret, and pulled Lillian in the direction of the exit. They were followed by the guys who wanted to walk them home from the club. George was one of them. He looked at Lillian embarrassedly, and she grinned and condescendingly let him walk along. The young man kept silent, but when they arrived at Lillian's house, he finally decided to confess his feelings for her and asked her out on a date. "Believe me, you will be the happiest woman with me," George began to persuade her passionately. "I'll certainly be happy, but not with you," rudely replied Lillian, and disappeared into the house without even saying goodbye. George stood for a while and went home. He was upset, but he had not lost hope. He was sure that Lillian would change her attitude towards him when he bought her a beautiful ring. He only had to wait for the bonus that was due to him at the end of the month as the best mechanic. For the next few days, all George could think about was Lillian, but no matter how many times he tried to talk to her, the girl would slip away with a disgruntled look on her face. At the end of the month, George went to the neighboring city and bought the most beautiful ring, which took all of his bonus and salary. His mother was angry at him for a long time afterward, but George was pleased because now Lillian just wouldn't resist. But it turned out differently. "Well, what do I need it for?" grumbled the girl when one evening George handed her the ring. "It's a waste of money." "Didn't you like it?" asked George bitterly. "Lillian, I love you. I want to marry you. That's it. I'm fed up with you." "George, you should understand that I am not for you," exclaimed Lillian as she slammed the door in front of his face. George stood there in a complete stupor for several minutes, until he finally realized that all his dreams had been shattered. He went into the first bar he saw and got very drunk for the first time in his life. Meanwhile, Lillian was already rushing on the train towards her dream. The girl had long dreamed of leaving the countryside for the city and had no regrets. She was tired of the quiet life in the backwater town, her constantly drinking mother, and the ordinary guys who were constantly trying to be her boyfriend. She believed that things would be very different in the city. On her first day, she rented a small apartment with another girl and took a job as a waitress at a cafe. A year passed, and Lillian was enjoying city life. She was making good money and even managed to save some up. Life seemed like a real fairy tale to Lillian, except for one thing: she was missing a prince. But soon, Frederick appeared. Lillian had noticed him even before he entered the cafe. He got out of a fancy car, was fashionably dressed, and his expensive watch gleamed on his hand. Lillian immediately realized that she had finally met the long-awaited millionaire. The man also paid attention to Lillian, and they exchanged phone numbers. Soon, a stormy romance began between them, and within a week, Lillian moved in with Frederick in his luxurious apartment. She dreamed of legalizing their relationship, especially after finding out she was pregnant. Lillian was over the moon and hurried to inform Frederick, expecting a marriage proposal. "Is it true?" smiled Frederick. "I'm so happy. What are we going to do next?" asked Lillian hopefully, not realizing that Frederick had not proposed yet. "Next is a long and happy life together, and of course a wedding," he said joyfully, and kissed Lillian tenderly on the nose. She was overjoyed and threw herself into his arms. Then, Frederick began to prepare for his business, while Lillian went to work. But as they stood in the hallway, Frederick suddenly hesitated and looked puzzled at his phone screen. "Is something wrong, dear?" asked Lillian affectionately. "Oh, it's nothing. It's just that the money I transferred from my account hasn't arrived on my card. There must be some error in the application. It's bad timing. Delivered from Europe." What should I do now?" "Oh, that's not a problem at all. Let me give it to you," Lillian eagerly responded. "I managed to put some aside." "Darling, you just saved me," exclaimed Frederick. "I'll return everything to you tonight." "Come on, honey, we're already family," smiled Lillian, and together they headed to the cash machine. And in the evening, when Lillian, as usual, waited for Frederick at the cafe, he didn't appear. His phone was available, and Lillian became worried. She waited for him all night in his apartment, and in the morning, the doorbell rang. Lillian rushed to open it, rejoicing that Frederick had finally returned, but to her great dismay, there was a middle-aged woman on the threshold. She pushed Lillian aside and resolutely entered the apartment, looking for someone. "So where is this swindler, Brian?" asked the strange woman menacingly. "He hasn't paid my rent in 2 months. I'm not going to put up with it anymore." "Brian?" surprised Lillian. "Only Frederick, and I live here." "I don't know." "He introduced himself to me as Brian," declared the woman. "Anyway, you deal with him yourself, and I have to ask you to leave my apartment immediately." Lillian was stunned to realize that she had become the victim of a conman and an Alphonse. The girl was angry at herself for being too trusting. In this situation, she couldn't return the money, but she needed to do something about her pregnancy, and as soon as possible. At the clinic, the doctor immediately warned Lillian that after the abortion, she would probably not be able to have more children because of her negative Rh factor. The prospect of being left alone in a foreign city with a baby in her arms did not make Lillian happy, but imagining that she would never be able to give birth to a son for her future husband frightened her even more, and she decided to give birth. After giving birth, Lillian did not turn into a perfect mother, but she felt responsible for her newborn son, so she tried her best, and luckily for her, her roommate Rebecca helped her with everything. After 6 months, Lillian returned to work at the cafe. She lived modestly, but thoughts of a wealthy husband did not leave her. And then one day, an Italian tourist in his 50s dropped by her cafe. He immediately paid attention to Lillian and invited her to the restaurant in the evening. Although her son was waiting for her at home, Lillian agreed, persuading Rebecca to stay with Tyler for a longer time. Raphael charmed Lillian from the very first evening, and she felt incredibly happy when she returned every morning from his hotel. Just a month later, Raphael told her he was going back home and invited Lillian to fly with him. The woman was just waiting for that and immediately agreed, but when the conversation turned to the baby, Raphael's reaction puzzled her. "No, I don't need a baby in my house." The man waved his hands. "I've grown children myself. Why would I want someone else's baby? I don't want to complicate my life." "Yes, of course you are right," confused Lillian replied. "But what about Tyler? Look, our plane leaves at 10 in the evening. I'll buy you a ticket, but only one." Raphael replied, leaving Lillian alone with her problem. Xmas perceptually Lillian hesitated. On one hand, there was Tyler and a hard life here, and on the other hand, a secure life with Raphael in Italy. After a couple of hours, she made up her mind. Italy. Rebecca was not at home, and Lillian wrote her a letter, telling her that she was leaving for good and asked her to take Tyler to her mother. Then Lillian gathered her things, woke the child, and took him to an elderly neighbor, whom she asked to look after the boy while she supposedly went to the store for milk. "I'm sorry, baby, but I can't do otherwise," she whispered in the boy's ear and closed the door behind her. Then she got into a pre-arranged cab and went to the airport while little Tyler was still sitting on the elderly lady's couch, anxiously looking at the front door and waiting for his mother. Rebecca came home from work late. She read the letter and immediately took Tyler away from her neighbor. She was shocked that Lillian could do such a thing. The woman barely managed to calm down because Tyler was crying and wouldn't stop calling out for his mother until he fell into a restless sleep. The next day, Rebecca took a little leave and went to visit Lillian's mother. But when she arrived in the town, she quickly realized that the woman was a long-time alcoholic and did not want to hear anything about her daughter or her grandson. Upset, Rebecca went to the nearby store. They went to a nearby store to buy water and asked the saleswoman if Lillian had any other relatives in town. At that moment, George walked in. When he heard about what Lillian had done, he was stunned, not understanding how he could ever have wanted to marry such a heartless woman. George and Rebecca walked out of the store together, and the man invited her to tea. He also walked her to the bus in the evening. A couple of days later, he came to visit her in the city, and 6 months later, they got married and adopted Tyler. 20 years passed and George and Rebecca were living in the city, where they had their own business. One day, George was walking down the street when he heard someone call out to him. He turned around and was dumbfounded to see Lillian standing 3 steps away from him. She looked much older than her years, her eyes were tired, and she looked a bit shabby. "I hardly recognize you." "You look so good," she said admiringly. "How are you?" Hi Lillian, expectation. I'm fine. I moved to the city, as you can see, George answered discreetly. What about you? Lillian explained that she had lived in Italy for a long time, but her Italian husband had bequeathed everything to his children. After his death, she had to return to her homeland without a penny to her name. Now she was working as a waitress again. The woman wondered if her former admirer was married. When she found out that he had a wife, Rebecca, and 2 children, Claire and Tyler, she turned pale. George noticed this and said, "Yes, Lillian, he is your son. And we adopted him. Tyler is an athlete and his coach says he has a great future." "My little son," whispered Lillian. "Can I see him?" "Why? You made your choice when you traded him for an Italian and left him with strangers," George replied. After saying this, he went on his way without saying goodbye, and Lillian stood looking after him for a long time, realizing that she had missed so many opportunities to be happy in her life, and that she had done so foolishly and hopelessly.